Mom.
He just looks like a little businessman.
He does. He looks like he's waiting for someone to deliver an important package.
Yes, it's called treats, and he wants them all.
Bark box. When's the bark box due?
Ooh, it's coming in this week.
That's what it is. That's what he's waiting for.
Oh, Sonic. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Quarantine.
We are in the second week of Pride Month already, and excitedly watching our dogs do things.
And by things we mean, we're watching my little white dog sitting on the couch across from our table right now, and he's just sitting up with his little paws out like a very important businessman. We said that he needs a pink earring and a cigar.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's gone to bed. He's over our shenanigans. So we're coming at you for our video now.
Yeah. So I'm Mitch. I use he, him, his pronouns.
I'm Amy. I use she, her pronouns. And this week we are talking about our favorite moment in queer history. Yeah. So we've got a couple of really interesting stories for you today. I'm sorry, I have dog fur in my mask. It's kind of a riskier run working from home with two dogs. Yeah. So anyway, now that I've gotten the dog fur out of my nose, I want to talk a little bit about this really cool moment in history that I found one day. I stumbled upon it online about a club that used to exist in France. So we're going to get started.
Woo.
All right. So during the 1920s, Paris had been known for all of the different things you could do for nightlife. And it was also a really free and open attitude toward life in general. So because of this, there were a lot of businesses that were catered towards same-sex people, or same-sex attracted people, rather. And among these clubs, which is going to be the one I'm talking about, was the club Monocle, which is credited with being, the first and most famous lesbian nightclub. So it was created by a woman named Lulu de Montparnasse. Got it right this time.
Nailed it.
In Montmartre, which was the main gathering place for Parisian lesbians. So beyond just the Monocle, there were about 20 or 30 other nightclubs that were catered towards the LGBTQ community, which is huge. I mean, even by today's standards, that's huge, but especially in the 20s, it's absolutely unheard of. So, yeah, it was a really wild time over there. There's not a lot we know about Lulu. We don't even actually know if Lulu was her real name. She was a very mysterious person, but what we do know is that Lulu created a total haven for gay women. So during the day, women could be seen sitting together outside of cafes or dancing at the Moulin Rouge, and Le Monocle was different in a lot of ways. So the name itself came sort of from the sort of calling card that they had of the time, which was dressing as men in tuxedos, wearing a hair bob, and typically also wearing a monocle, which had been sort of the uniform for same-sex attracted women at that time. And it was a super subtle way of letting people know, hey, I see you, do you see me? So when the Nazis had occupied Berlin in the 1930s, Paris had taken over as sort of the hub of the LGBTQ community. So there was a really liberal idea around gender and sex in Paris to begin with. So one of the problems they did run into was what they called gawkers. Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of men who would perform in drag, but because of that, it wasn't widely practiced or spoken about. So a lot of cis people, a lot of heterosexual people would go to these clubs where men were performing in drag, and they would just openly ogle and stare, which is why they were called gawkers. Gender, sex, and orientation were also openly discussed and celebrated, so it was a chance for people to go see what everything was about and what was going on, and talk about, what does this mean? What does this look like? How does this develop? But, people took problem with people just coming and staring at them, which, of course, I wouldn't be happy about that either.
It's not a spectator sport.
Right. But on like a more positive side of this, the LGBTQ community often also took in other marginalized communities. So they would take in runaway children, they would take in migrant groups. So it was, even back then, a very open and accepting and just loving community where they took in the people who were the misfits out of society. So I love that.
Sounds like the Stonewall.
Yeah. Well, just you wait, because that will be coming up later. So there's not a ton of history written about the Monocle, but there are a lot of gorgeous pictures that are found online. They're all obviously in black and white, and they're stunning. So you can find those online, and you can find them in galleries today. So the pictures are by a photographer whose name is Brasai. If you Google his name, or if you Google Le Monocle, you'll find these pictures. I highly recommend you find them. They're so beautiful, and I love seeing them dressed in these perfect, pristine tuxedos, and other women wearing their beautiful dresses and their curly bobs. Oh my gosh, it is so cute. And there's one picture where they're all wearing their monocles together. It is so cute. It's like this big society picture, and I love it. So I'll post a couple of those in here. And one of the most famous pictures from Le Monocle shows a woman who was named Violette Morris. So Violette Morris was a heavyweight lifting champion, and she was often pictured at Le Monocle. She was a really big focal point for Versailles. But when the Germans occupied France in the 1940s, Violette turned spy for the Gestapo. So she turned against her country and her community. So, we know now that this was most likely a means of survival, but at the time it was just this huge betrayal to her people.
Well, it's a betrayal and also a survival thing. Yeah.
So it was really difficult for them to come to terms with. And Violette actually, she gave Germany partial plans, she gave them strategic points within Paris, and she gave them schematics for the French army's main tank. And without all this information, this information proved crucial to the eventual invasion in 1940. So Lulu, during this time, tried to keep the bar open, but she closed it eventually to protect her patrons because it was more and more dangerous. So after Germany had invaded, homosexuality became a criminal act, and people were arrested and killed for it. Legally, you couldn't be killed on the basis of homosexuality. There wasn't a death penalty for that, but, they managed to make it happen. So there was a lot of risk for the LGBTQ community in Paris during this time. And Violette herself was tasked with torturing women, despite or maybe because of her dalliance in the Monocle. Ultimately, she was killed by a resistance movement in 1944, which happened right before the war ended, and she ended up being buried in a communal grave. So she doesn't have her own grave. She just kind of buried with history and moving on. So during the war, I thought this was crazy interesting. The age of consent became a targeted attack. So for heterosexual people, it was raised from 13 to 15, which is freakishly young to begin with. Still. But for the LGBTQ people, it was raised to 21. So because of the difference in age, it made it really easy to target and attack LGBTQ people. And actually, this age of consent was kept at 21 until 1974, when it was lowered down to 18, and then it was lowered to 15 in 1982. So still crazy young, but it took an additional 42 years to lower that age of consent in a way that it wasn't easy to attack and target LGBTQ people. Yeah. So there was also an issue in the 50s and 60s where LGBTQ people were kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's fine to be LGBTQ, it's fine to be gay, it's fine to do drag, but we don't want to see it, we don't want to hear about it.
Kind of like don't ask, don't tell.
Exactly. And in 1960, there was a morality law that was passed, which made it so much easier still to target. So law enforcement and authorities were able to target gay men and women under the guise of what they called an indecent exposure. Yeah.
So what constituted an indecent exposure?
So from what I could find during research, it looked like even just holding hands and kissing was considered indecent exposure because we were exposing her children.
Right.
Yeah, so it was incredibly difficult to be LGBTQ in Paris, which is shocking considering that in 1791, it had been decriminalized. So in just a short period of time, from 1940 to 1944, everything from the last 200 years leading up to it was gone, which is, kind of the case for everything that Germany touched during World War II. It was wild to see such a radical shift from Paris being known as a hub for artists and actresses and musicians and vagabonds and bohemian people, and then all of a sudden it was just taken away. So I thought it was really interesting when I was reading those. Men were more often targeted than women. And I also was really surprised to see that only trans women were allowed to perform in drag. So it was illegal for cis men to perform in drag. I think, as far as I could see, the reasoning behind it was because trans women were basically men that looked like women. So it was okay because they were feminine presenting. So they could wear feminine clothing. But men who were more masculine presenting could not dress in drag because they were men and they couldn't do that. So they sort of erased the whole identity of trans people in saying like, well, you're just, you're a glorified woman or you're a glorified man. So it was a complete erasure of their entire identity. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I didn't know about that at all. And also, really similarly to the United States, there were tons of bar raids constantly going on. And a lot of times, the owners of the bars would be the one helping facilitate these raids. Yeah. A lot of them were working with, people who had their hands in the government and who kind of had the government in their pockets. So they would facilitate these raids on their own bars. So a lot of times gay women specifically tended to avoid gay clubs, and they would rather meet with their friends in smaller groups. So they would meet at each other's houses for tea, or they would go walking at the park together, but they wouldn't go to bars. So another reason why men were disproportionately arrested for being homosexual in Paris during this time was because women didn't typically go to bars anyway. The working class women would be seen going to these bars, but upper class women were afraid, they were ashamed, they didn't want their secret to get out to society, so they hid it, and they instead would go over to each other's houses, which I thought was, an interesting survival tactic because...
Well, I think too, like, society has kind of like a double standard for men versus women, where women it's fairly like the trope, at least in the United States, the trope of like the spinster, right? It's just a woman who never married because she never married, but they never like run too far into as to what that might be. And she could get left alone, but like a man who never married or who was only seen in company with other men, even if like he wasn't presenting outside of his gender role, like that was always something that raised alarms with people.
Yeah, so it was an interesting time of navigation for men and women. So in 1971, there was this wave of feminism that followed in the wake of student and worker uprisings in 1968. I didn't do a ton of research into that because it wasn't specifically geared toward the rights of LGBTQ people, but it is on my list of things to read about because I didn't know about these uprisings. But you mentioned earlier, it's similar to Stonewall. So in 1971, after feminism, after the uprisings, and after the Stonewall riots in New York City, the Homosexuality Revolutionary Action Front was created. So the actions and the fighting of the people in the Action Front actually led to police files on gay men and women being destroyed by them. So all of these targets that they had put on their backs, they managed to get destroyed, so the police couldn't use these files and continue to persecute and attack homosexual people. Yeah, isn't that wild? So cool. The other thing that was really interesting was that they managed to make an overhaul and get a bunch of anti-gay laws repealed. And in 1981, homosexuality was declassified as a mental illness. So we're making waves. Another wave came later on in the 80s during the AIDS crisis. So it hit America, but it also definitely hit France. And during that time, they did a lot of advocating to get better health care and to get more laws to protect LGBTQ people. So a long time later, in 2013, marriage was legalized in France for the LGBTQ community, although it was not without hostility, because the same year an anti-gay demonstration was held. So there was still a lot of opposition, despite the fact that so much movement had been made toward, kind of normalizing this life. So currently, though, France ranks among the highest of LGBTQ-friendly places. That's not to say there's not work to do. So right before COVID, there were lawmakers coming together to discuss the rights of access to more services for LGBTQ people. Mm-hmm. So right now in France, it's still technically illegal for a lesbian couple to have IVF, in vitro fertilization. So that was one of the things that they were going to be talking about on the Supreme Court. But because of COVID, they haven't been able to come back together as a Supreme Court to make their ruling. So there are still a few laws that are hanging in limbo here, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see what France does, especially given sort of the similar climate that we've got going on right here, where, in 2020 we're still, fighting for federal protective laws. So I think it would be interesting to see what they do, and I'm definitely going to bring an update to that here. Yeah, so I didn't say this at the start, and I should have. A lot of this information came from a book called A History of Homosexuality in Europe, Volumes 1 and 2, by Florence Tamain. I highly recommend that you read this if you're interested in it. It was all about London, Berlin, and Paris. So, good stuff.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I definitely recommend you guys do some digging on it.
Is the Monocle still standing?
It is. So it reopened. It's called New Monocle now, but it is not the same kind of
inevitably
business. I would be careful doing some Googling. It is still for the LGBTQ population and for everybody at large, but it's a very specific, how do I say it? It's not a lifestyle you or I would partake in. So I would just advise you to be very careful if you're doing a Google search of New Monocle. But certainly Google Le Monocle from back in the 20s, because you're going to find all the old paintings and portraits and all the information.
All those photographs.
Yeah. So.
And do you think it's going to get designated as a historical site like Stonewall has been?
I don't know. I don't know how much history is really still there. I think there's a definite chance that when all that persecution started happening, whatever history was written, whatever information about Lulu Montmartre was there, I think may have been destroyed. I don't have hard proof of this.
Well, if not by then, but by the action front even.
Yeah, so I don't know. I'm not sure what the history looks like for them in France. I would assume it might eventually become. I would love to see somebody take it back over and turn it back into what it was. And it's really cool. So if you do Google it, the building front is in the shape of a monocle. So it's a building, like just a straight, wall. Mm-hmm. But then the painting on it is in the shape of a monocle, and you walk through the center of the monocle to get in, which I thought was so cool. So they did maintain that integrity of it. It's a different color scheme now and a different business. But yeah, I would love to see it brought back to what it used to be.
That'd be so cool. Yeah, because what's really neat about the Stonewall that I didn't realize is it is actually still a functioning bar. Mm-hmm. Like it functions in much the same way, and they kept the black walls on the inside and the Christmas lights, mm-hmm. which is how it was decorated in the original era, and it maybe has gone through some different iterations before arriving at where it is now. But yeah, we went in there my last trip to New York City, and it was a really cool experience. So I'd love to do the same thing in Paris.
Oh, I know. I would love to even just stand outside of it. I went to Stonewall when I was in New York City too, and it was such a humbling experience. And I kind of wonder if it's the same for the people of France. I would love to speak with somebody in France about it.
That would be cool.
Yeah.
Get a pen pal.
I know. I've already got one in France, but she's not near France. She's not near France. she's from France, but she's not nearby. She's not near Paris.
She's in far France.
She is in very far France.
Well, so we kind of talked about like some symbolism, like with the monocle, right? And like don't ask, don't tell also kind of came up, which both kind of tie into my story. So this is literally one of my favorite things to talk about. I talk about this all the time, and I find it both like really funny and like really sad. But we'll get into it. So we're gonna go over the rainbow for a minute. Yeah, the first time we tried to record this video, I was rocking my Golden Girls Pride shirt, and like B. Arthur was like right here on my heart where she belongs. But that like wasn't the Dorothy that I'm talking about when I say the Friends of Dorothy, although that could be a modern interpretation now that I think about it.
The Golden Girls is alive and well in the LGBTQ community, including between yours truly.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many board
There's
games
actually a really, really amazing group of drag queens that do the Golden Girls, and they are so funny. Like, I can't even stand it. It's so well done. But yeah, so I'm talking about the Friends of Dorothy. So, the friend in gay slang, a friend of Dorothy is usually a gay man, or it could be more broadly like any LGBTQ person. And this phrase, it's often believed to have like really become popular during World War II. So that's when homosexual acts were illegal in the United States, but not so much in like the staunch language that would come later. We don't actually know the exact origin of the phrase, but a lot of people do believe that it's derived from the character Dorothy Gale, who goes to Oz to speak truth to power. And so, like, actually, if you look at the books, which the sequel was written in 1909, and in that book, according to Wikipedia, which I know is not the ideal source, don't at me about it, the book introduces readers to a character named Polychrome, who, upon meeting Dorothy's traveling companions, exclaims, "You have some queer friends, Dorothy." And then Dorothy replies, "The queerness doesn't matter so long as they're friends." So this isn't even the only part of the books that's considered a reference to the LGBTQ community, which I didn't know. Although, of course, we can't know if those were L. Frank Baum's like real intentions, right? But like when Dorothy asks the Scarecrow which way she should go on the yellow brick road, he tells her, of course, some people go both ways, which a lot of people have like adopted as like a nod to bisexuality. And there actually is even a character who has their gender magically changed from female to male in order to disguise the fact that they were the rightful heir to Oz, which is like my dream come true. Like, sign me up. But the strongest case for the connection being solidified between Oz and this saying comes from the 1939 movie, The Wizard of Oz, which is based on that first book, and Judy Garland stars as Dorothy. So her character accepts without question those who are different from her, including the dandelion, and the difficulties they face along the way, the Wicked Witch including, are kind of connected by a lot of people to the struggles of coming out. The way the group of outcast bands together references like the chosen families that we form in the community, and the characters never end up having to change who they really are to come out well and successful in the end.
I love that. I didn't realize all those connections were.
Yeah.
That's like, I love that. It's beautiful.
Well, and also too, like if you, there's a really, really good article that I was reading about it from, I think it was from Out Magazine themselves, but like it talks about the fact that Dorothy doesn't have a love interest, and so that heteronormative, like romantic, like misogynistic, oftentimes plot just doesn't exist in this story, which was unheard of for the time. So that's kind of another reason that the gay community really connected with this story.
Yeah, because there was no like struggle to find representation in these characters, which is so often the case in media where, I feel like we're just kind of getting baited.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very, like, at least well built into it. Whether or not it was intentional, unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever know. But actually, World War II began the same year that the movie came out in 1939, and so within the years to come, gay men were going to end up going off to war because of the draft or because they enlisted, and so they needed a way to connect with one another in a safe way when you couldn't like use these terms, or many people honestly didn't know these terms to call themselves gay or straight or homosexual, especially people coming from like rural areas. But like this story became something that was so visible and accessible to so many people that it became part of the vibrant subculture that they built at home and abroad. So homosexuality, of course, is a long-standing presence in military operations, like going back to ancient Greece, there's evidence of this. And so this just became a new way for specifically gay men to communicate it and build community with one another. So it is important to note that there actually is another origin theory for the saying as well. In the 1920s and the 1930s in New York City, attitudes about like the LGBTQ community were similar to Paris, a little bit more open-minded. Like we had made a lot of progress up until that point that was completely destroyed by the Nazi regime and by the war. But there was an American author, poet, and critic named Dorothy Parker who was involved very strongly in left-wing ideology, including her like well-noted friendships and company that she kept with gay men. So she would throw these super lavish parties that gay men could gain entrance to by using the phrase that they were a friend of Dorothy's. She was a really witty, sarcastic, and incredibly socially active person, including like in actual social activism. So when these men were to go off to war, facing the early beginnings of the ban on homosexuality in the military as it was starting to get like written into place, this phrase could, again, have become a way for them to find one another, having known Dorothy or not. So Dorothy Parker actually got blacklisted for her beliefs and her support of the gay community, which is probably why we haven't heard as much about this version of the theory. Like, I had never heard of her before.
Yeah, I don't think
doing the
either.
research for this. But she was considered like really, really like a big deal in her day, and almost all of her work has been completely just like brushed aside because of like this connection. Still though, I think that the term persisted, even if it didn't originate, because like so much money got spent on making The Wizard of Oz, and it became such a part of like national culture that it wasn't something that they could put away. And I also want to note too that in the British military service, the lingo that they were using at the time was saying that they were a friend of Mrs. King, which of course alludes to being a friend of the Queen.
Okay.
And so that's how like the Queens found each other.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's so incredible to me the way that people manage to overcome in order to bring some semblance of peace and normalcy to their life.
Well, and finding ways to communicate like with one another when you couldn't say these words out loud in public, or even like look at each other. Like the lesbian head nod would not have been a thing.
Right.
But I mean, it could have been a thing.
Could have been a thing, but instead they used a monocle for it. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and these are the terms that they were able to use. Speaking of lesbians, actually, I can't continue without also mentioning my legendary hero, Johnny Phelps.
I love her.
So she was a sergeant in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. And in 1947, after she had actually re-enlisted after her first honorable discharge, she was told by General Eisenhower that it had come to his attention that there were lesbians in the Women's Army Corps, and he wanted to ferret them all out. So she told him, if the general pleases, sir, I'll be happy to do that, but the first name on the list will be mine. And then Eisenhower's secretary said, if the general pleases, sir, my name will be first and hers will be second. And I couldn't figure out why she switched them, but then I realized because she was going to write the list because she's the secretary, so she was going to take it down. So the joke hit, even like over 50 years later.
I love that. Oh my gosh.
So Phelps then told Eisenhower that there are lesbians in the Women's Army Corps, but like she'll only make the list if he's ready to replace all of the file clerks, section commanders, drivers, and every woman in the detachment. But then she also let him know that they are the most decorated group of women of people in the military, really, because there had been no illegal pregnancies, no AWOLs, or any charges of misconduct whatsoever. So Eisenhower actually dropped the hunt for lesbians in the military, which was a standard that actually persisted for a while after that. And Miss Phelps was honorably discharged a second time. And then she didn't go back right away. But she actually ended up serving on a committee for the Veterans Affairs Department.
Okay.
Later on in life, I found out because I was reading more about her last night too. So shout out to her. So also here, I want to note that as we're fast forwarding to June 1969, when the Stonewall riot happened, there were actually people who theorized that Judy Garland's death, which had just happened a few days prior to the riots, was what triggered them due to her large gay male following. They used to actually say that at a Judy Garland concert, the front row was the meeting of the Mattachine Society because so many gay men followed her so religiously. Now, this is a patently false claim, but it does still get referenced sometimes. And I think it persists in places where the Stonewall riots are falsely credited to white gay men instead of the transgender, gender nonconforming, and lesbian women of color that actually ignited the riots.
It's interesting, too, that they would say that the death of an idol would cause a violent riot against police.
Yeah.
It's
like, I would think that, like, the fact that police were coming and arresting people who were just trying to dance is enough without having to worry about whether or not someone who sings dies.
right.
But maybe that's me. I don't know.
It's interesting that it sort of erases the entire struggle and the true cause of
and I think that was very purposefully done in the early decades of the movement, because there's a lot of like, how can we make ourselves relatable in order to progress the growth that we need to see. So I'm sure it was intentional.
Yeah.
But let's fast forward again to the early 1980s. So this is the part that really makes me laugh, but it's also not funny, but I think it's funny. So the U.S. Naval Intelligence Service had realized that, shockingly, countless gay sailors all had a friend named Dorothy. They wanted to get rid of all homosexuals in the military, of course, a stance that they had just doubled down on by discharging a sailor named Mel Dahl, who had been open with his sexuality before, but he got the boot upon reiterating it while having his security clearance upgraded. And he did actually go to court against the U.S. military over his dishonorable discharge. But the goal on the Navy's behalf became to find out who this Dorothy was, so that they could put pressure on her to find out who all of the homosexuals in the Navy were, and then they could get rid of them.
So, do we actually know what ended up happening with Mel Dahl's case?
So I did some digging on it, and I could not find an actual decision rendered. I just found an article about when the case was brought, as well as there's a book called Conduct Unbecoming by Randy Schultz that I'm going to talk more about in a minute. And in that, it mentions the fact that he brought the case, but it doesn't seem to say anything about the results of the case. But given that this was a precedent that consisted for a really long time and just kind of got doubled down on more and more, I don't think he was successful in his appeal of his dishonorable discharge, unfortunately. But according to Conduct on Becoming, which it's a really awesome book about lesbians and gay men in the United States military. And in that book, Randy Schultz talks about the fact that the U.S. Navy actually spent a large sum of money to send investigators to gay bars in the Chicago area, trying to locate gay sailors and target them so that they could be removed from the naval service. So that's when Dorothy's name started to come up. Okay. Their goal was to out as many sailors as possible, and Dorothy was going to help them do that. So taxpayer money actually funded an investigation which consisted of these investigators going in as plainclothes civilians to these gay bars, and like the gay sailors were very intentional about like only using the language friend of Dorothy, and not like calling themselves homosexual or gay.
Okay.
So it became kind of difficult for them to actually have any like results. Like the results were not good based on this investigation.
Trying to find this one lone Dorothy.
Yeah, but other investigations that they had trying to find and identify homosexual sailors were successful enough that in 1981 alone, Randy Schultz reported that 1,976 members of the U.S. military were ousted for homosexuality allegations. Because a lot of this stuff, they didn't have hard and fast proof. It was just like if somebody could allege that you were gay or infer that you were gay, like it was enough for you to just lose your job.
Well, and it's so easy, too, to be like, if you don't fit within this machismo mold, you're gay.
Yep.
Or if you don't fall within this wilting flower feminine mold, you're gay.
You're going to love this. Oh. You're going to love this one real much. So remember I talked about our friend Johnny Phelps and how that kind of began a few decades of lesbians like not being targeted for being ousted. That ended in 1990. So Vice Admiral Joseph S. Donnell issued a memo as to how lesbians could be identified so they could start doing a better job of removing the lesbian homosexuals, the female homosexuals as well. So here's a quote for you.
Okay.
The stereotypical female homosexual in the Navy is hardworking, career-oriented, willing to put in long hours on the job, and is among the command's top professionals.
And that's a bad thing.
And those are the people that they're trying to get rid of, yeah. The ones that are doing their jobs.
So it's interesting to me because part of me wants to laugh and be like, oh, what a terrible thing lesbians are to be doing their job. But then a part of me is like, they were truly persecuted and ferreted out strictly for being lesbian. But upon the guys that they were hard workers.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense at all because, I mean, if nothing else, even if you're not in agreement with gay women being in the military, I mean, I feel like you would want the people who are so hardworking and so driven to protect their country being the ones in the positions where they're protecting their country.
So the argument that they tried to make, not to, be this guy in history class that nobody likes. But so homosexuality was really considered an ethical violation by these people who had never been challenged to think about it in any terms other than that. And so I think, and this is just me giving like the biggest grain of salt ever, is that the assumption kind of was, if they're violating this ethical standard in society, what other harm might they perpetuate? Which is like, let's unpack that some other time when we have more time. But that's where I think it really, unfortunately, came from, which is...
I mean, that makes sense, but I still kind of feel like...
Yeah, it's a lot. But that's exactly what I'm talking about. So literally right before that 1,976 number was going to get ousted, in the year 1979, a small little group called the Village People, which are arguably the gayest band in America, wrote a song called In the Navy. Victor Willis actually is the one who wrote the song. And that song became really, really popular. And the Navy decided hey, we should use this in recruitment campaigns. So the Village People actually references Greenwich Village, which is the home to the Stonewall Inn, Christopher Street, and the modern gay rights movement in New York City. And we're talking 10 years after Stonewall here. And, you know, in the Village People, it's consisted of gentlemen who are dressed up as, like, those gay stereotype characters. So literally the gayest band in America. The Navy actually, like, finally put two and two together, and they ended up not using the song for recruitment, but it wasn't until after the Village People filmed on the deck of the USS Reasoner. And so they had the footage, so they ended up using it for the music video. But, like, go watch the In the Navy music video and understand that it was meant to be a recruitment.
Oh my gosh.
And just enjoy yourself, like, because it's just mind-blowing.
I have 2 comments on this. 1, I can't wait to go watch that video. And 2, I would really love to sit down with the person who was making decisions about the military and homosexuality within the military and be like, did you open your eyes at all?
Yeah, I mean, the hypocritical thinking there, it's unbelievable. But, like, so many people had such a blind eye to so many things. Like,
so interesting.
And so, actually, like, moving on from there, in 1993, which actually was the year before I was born, even.
I was 1 year old.
So the year we made our first
sandwich
debut.
years.
Yeah. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was put into place. Now, Don't Ask, Don't Tell caused much more direct homophobia and biphobia to prevent perfectly well-qualified people from serving their country. And that law actually persisted, as we know, until 2011, when the ban on homosexuality in the military was lifted once and for all. So the battle there has now shifted to the current administration working to ban transgender identified people from military service. So we're probably about to go through this same cycle, although I'm hoping it doesn't take as long this time, because we've been from 2011 all the way back to 1939 was when we were trying to get gay men and lesbians and bisexual identified people able to serve their country without persecution on the job.
It's so interesting to me, too, that in both of our lifetimes was when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was put into place. So I was a year old when that started, and I was either a freshman or a sophomore, depending on what time of year that came out, in college. So, I mean, I had friends in ROTC.
Mm-hmm. I was a junior in high school, and I had just founded a gay straight alliance at my high school when that happened. So, yeah, no, it's a lot of that history is very, very relevant and, like, close to our timelines. So they never found Dorothy, of course, because Dorothy wasn't a real person, but they did spend years and a lot of money looking for her. I just haven't been able to find a specific number.
That was going to be my question.
Yeah, I really want to know how much got spent on that, but also I kind of don't in many ways. So especially they were afraid, too, that Dorothy was a communist leader and that Dorothy was a communist organizer who was recruiting people to be gay for the communist cause.
Oh my goodness.
That was a part of the investigation as well. You don't hear the term Friends of Dorothy too often anymore, or calls for Friends of Dorothy anymore, because we have shifted our culture to be more inclusive and safe to clearly state how we identify. However, sources do say that on cruise ships that they will call for Friends of Dorothy to meet on a certain deck, and it'll be like an LGBTQ cocktail hour when you get up there. But it's a way of, like, subtly calling the community together.
Interesting. I will never be able to confirm or deny that because you won't catch me dead or alive on a cruise ship. But that sounds like a fun little callback.
The only cruise you're ever going to catch me on is going to be a Disney cruise, and I just get the odd feeling that they won't do it there.
Probably not.
I wonder
They
why.
might do it on a Golden Girls cruise, though. And those
Yes, and then it is B. Arthur. Full circle moments. Love it. So actually the first Pride I ever attended was in Rochester in 2013, and it was a top to bottom Wizard of Oz themed Pride. So, like, I actually made this really cute denim vest that had a rainbow lion on it that said "Not a Coward Anymore." to celebrate the fact that I was finally moving forward in my own authenticity. So, like, Wizard of Oz is still a pervasive part of LGBTQ culture, which has only been amplified by Wicked, the Broadway musical, which has a lot of, like, references of its own and ties to the community as well. But I just think it's really cool how these stories of embracing our differences, changing our culture, and enduring struggles with the people who genuinely care for us are, like, a timeless part of our culture now. Whether or not they were intended to be in the first place, they certainly are now.
And it's so interesting to see what was happening in France at the same time as the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so interesting also to see how that ripple effect from Nazi Germany affected so much wider than even where Germany had invaded at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And how just one person can set so much in motion.
Mm-hmm. For bad and for good.
Yeah.
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 But I think it's kind of cool how we totally didn't do it on purpose, but our stories tied together as well.
I know, that's why we call ourselves the Wonder Twins.
Wonder Twins. So yeah.
We have a little jingle.
I'm working on it. There is a jingle. It's in my brain.
We're also working on a jingle for our video, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll get there.
So we're going to do another video about another favorite moment in queer history later this month. But in the meantime, if you have any ideas of topics you want us to cover, or if you want to share your favorite moment with us, please send those our way. We would love to hear them. We love learning. We're both a couple of nerds.
Yeah.
So we're always doing research. We love it. So in the meantime, we'll keep doing some digging and finding some good topics to bring to you. And we hope you have a happy Pride until next week.
Lennox, want a cookie? He's snoring.
He's always snoring. That's just what he does. Bye.
Bye.